So don't be concerned if you're not, just starting out. So let's back up and start with introductions.
Yeah, I was going to introduce you.
Oh, you're going to introduce me. Okay, go ahead.
Good morning, everybody. I am Janet Alder. I'm an assistant dean in the School of Graduate Studies and associate professor in the Department of Neuroscience and Cell Biology at Robert Wood Johnson. And I think this is maybe the fourth year maybe that we're doing this workshop in the spring with Dr. Paul Copeland, who is a professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Biology, and who has been trained in the National Research Mentoring Network theory of specific aims writing. And so Dr. Copeland is a great resource for people who are trying to formulate specific aims and really get their head wrapped around what their proposal should entail. Like, what is the formatting, what is reasonable in terms of expectations for a fellowship. And so if you're writing an external fellowship or your thesis proposal, this is very valuable workshop. So thank you for joining us.
Always my pleasure, and I'm happy to join. So, Janet used a word. She used the word theory, and it's actually a good segue into a little bit of a rant that there's really nothing novel about this. The training I took, took an afternoon. There's nothing complex about what I'm about to tell you. It's just stuff that you may not have thought about, and it's encouragement for you to pay attention to things you might not have thought about. So take a deep breath. There's no stress here. You don't have to take notes or anything. We'll certainly be sending around the PowerPoint slides. And the other thing I want to say before I forget is I'm happy to look at specific aims pages from any student at any time. Very few people take me up on this offer, but if you want, and it's not going to be nice feedback. I don't usually spend the time to say this is a great sentence or whatever. But if you want critical feedback and you don't mind actual criticism, I'm happy to do that. All right, so let me share this thing. And by the way, feel free to interrupt. I'm not into this whole chatting questions. I think if you have a question, you can chat that you have a question, and then Janet, if you're going to monitor the chat, we can let them answer the question in person. All right, I'm going to do this. No, I'm not. I'm going to do this and go back. All right, so again, this presentation is focused on specific aims pages, but it's really just an excuse to talk about writing and the importance of writing. But I first like to start with this quote from Thomas Edison, because this is really what it's all about. That opportunity is often missed because in reality is actually work, and this is hard work, and it's iterative work, and arguably tedious, but incredibly important to think of it like this, right? You're not going to go through these kinds of grant writing seminars and suddenly come out on the other end able to sit down and write a grant in a day, right? That's just not how it works. All of this stuff is just to try and get you to pay more attention to the more subtle aspects of writing a grant proposal. Before I get into the nitty gritty, I need to give credit where credit's due. Janet mentioned the National Research Mentoring Network. They have a website. They have some good resources on there. I do have a list of resources that I recommend at the end of this presentation. But I want to give a shout out to Rick McGee, who really did the legwork as part of an NIH grant. Actually, he was funded to put this whole grant writing training session together. I'll tell you that narrative now because I often forget. What he did was to hire a communicator, professional communications person who is not a scientist. And he hired this person to read a bunch of grants and come up with what he calls rhetorical patterns, which simply means what are the reproducible things, elements that a trained communicator can pull out of a grant and what are the most important aspects of that, right, in terms of communicating an idea. And the fact that this person's not a scientist was actually really important, and that's kind of an important aspect of how you get feedback on your writing, in that you need to be able to communicate almost to the level where you're communicating with non-scientists. Not quite, but it's not a bad way to think about how you at least should start writing your proposals. Anyway, Rick did all this, and I went to a few of the sessions he actually had in-person sessions and groups. And out of all this, there's now a postdoc and faculty grant writing coach group that Susie Chen and Lauren Alexunas run. And I think it has continued and actually served quite a few people throughout the years. In a word, what you're trying to achieve in all of this is clarity. And I think that this is a really important concept to keep in mind as you're going back through your proposal. Just ask yourself the question or get feedback from somebody, is this clear? Very simple. Now the complex stuff. So I want you to take a minute to think about what you have to do when you're writing a proposal. And first of all, I don't have this on the slide, but first of all, I want you to consider who you're writing for and what you're writing for. I used to really get caught up in the writing, thinking that I was writing some serious document and something that, and it is serious, but something like almost for the sake of posterity and for the sake of science itself. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that you're really only writing this for three people. The three people, at least in the context of an NIH grant, that are going to critically review your work. Those are the only people you have to think about when you're writing this. So that kind of goes back to the point about clarity. The sophistication of your language and all of that is actually quite a bit secondary to the clarity of your language. Now, the primary thing you have to achieve in a proposal is to communicate a good idea. And there's a reason that this is on the top of the list, right? And I'll say this again at the end. There is no amount of good writing or workshops that's going to save a bad idea or a bad grant or a bad project, right? And that's what the reviewers are really going to be looking for, okay? Your goal is to make it easy for them to see how good your project is. Now, you obviously also have to demonstrate that you actually have some credibility in the field. And of course, this is a little bit difficult for students. But the main way that you can do that is to do all of the things that I'm about to tell you to do that everybody else does, essentially conform, which comes up again later. But I think this is really driving at the point where you have to demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of the field and be able to communicate that knowledge. You do generally want to demonstrate that you're working, and what that means is to provide some preliminary data. You also ideally want to show that you've successfully worked in this field, and that means having published. Again, these are things that are not necessarily as easy to come by when you're a student, but they're important things to know, are valuable pieces of sort of background that really help to make the reviewer be comfortable with the submission. This is really the conform part, right? You want to convince the reviewers that you're a member of the club, essentially. And I know that sounds a little sort of counterintuitive, but if you think of it from the reviewer standpoint, the last thing they want is some different sort of format or somebody trying to be creative with how they're presenting their science. They want uniformity in how things are presented so that they can go through and quickly evaluate the science. And finally, so again, intentionally, the writing is very important, but it's also the last thing on this list because all of these things are really important and they're all subordinate to having a good project. So let's talk about the reviewers. And I'm going to talk about this in the context of a typical NIH review. different agencies review things differently, but I think it's fairly safe to say that in terms of the type of reviewers that you have, there's strong similarity in the review processes. First and foremost, there will typically be someone who would be considered an expert in the field. Now, the degree to which they're an expert can vary quite a bit, but somebody who's submitting a biochemistry grant, you can pretty much be guaranteed a biochemist, not a biochemist in the same field necessarily, but will be a reviewer on the grant. And usually they'll be what's considered the primary reviewer. And we'll talk about that a bit later. Then you have I forget who came up with this term, but the sophisticated non-expert. This is somebody who's a scientist, of course, they're all scientists. Somebody who knows the field, but is not actually working in the field, right? So it's a little bit tangential. So, I guess if I were to use myself as an example, I consider myself a molecular biologist, and we work heavily in RNA and post-transcriptional stuff. If I were to be reviewing a transcription grant, right, that would be outside the field, well outside the fields. I don't really read that much of that literature, but I certainly could review a grant on transcription. Finally, you will potentially have a scientist again, but somebody who knows almost nothing about the topic, right? And this would be the case if I were to be reviewing a grant, let's say on neuroscience or traumatic brain injury, like Janet works on. I could probably review it and certainly would provide a unique perspective, which is part of the point of having these types of reviewers. But I'm not going to be the one saying, well, this control wasn't correct and this really doesn't make sense in the context of literature, that kind of thing. So there's an intentional design behind the selection of these reviewers, and it is to provide different perspectives on the review process. This last point over here about the technical expert, typically, I shouldn't say typically, occasionally, a review panel will include somebody who was brought in specifically for your grant because you propose something that's really specific and requires specific expertise that isn't otherwise on the panel. And that may be if there's a molecular biology grant again, but there was an aim that included a heavy statistical modeling section or a computational biology section, they might bring in a computational biologist to specifically just review that one grant. So what happens during the review process? From the perspective of a reviewer, the first thing you do is you see all of the titles and abstracts for all of the grants, and you rank the ones that you think that you're would be an expert or would be a good reviewer for. Then the review panel lead selects people for either the primary, the secondary, or the tertiary reviewer position. So the roles of these people is very different in the context of a panel. So the panel actually meets live and discusses each of these grants, but the only people who are actually contributing directly to the conversation are the reviewers. The primary reviewer is given the task of actually essentially explaining your grant to the rest of the panel, right? Again, only these three people have read the grant. And everybody else is kind of relying on these people to convey the strengths and weaknesses of this grant so that a consensus can be arrived at. So this primary reviewer is a really important person, if you think about it. You have to be thinking of making this person your advocate right from the get-go. And because if they don't like your grant, it's not going to get a good score, period. Now, the secondary reviewer you may think has significantly less sway, but that's actually not the case. And that's also not the case for the tertiary reviewer. Any one of these three people can totally derail an otherwise successful application if they bring up a point that they claim to be an expert about and wasn't included, or whatever. It's actually really easy, as you may know, to come up with negative things that can affect people's opinions. So, however, these other two reviewers, the secondary and tertiary reviewers, generally just support or rebut anything that the primary reviewer may have said. They're not getting a long presentation. And then once they've done this, actually at the very beginning, everybody says what score they gave, and then after this conversation, they determine whether or not the scores have changed. And then based on what these three people say their final scores are, the entire panel will provide a number. So it's actually possible and not uncommon for the panel to be listening to all this and say, you know what, I think these people are wrong. I'm going to score what's called outside the range. So the truth is anybody on this panel can have an effect on the overall score. And just to sort of round out this process, each grant gets read by these three people. Each reviewer typically gets anywhere from 5 to on a really bad session 10 grants. The cutoff, the pay line cutoff is dependent on which institute you're talking about. And if you take my class, we spend a whole session talking about the nitty gritty of how NIH review works. But the bottom line is only about 10 to 15% of the grants are going to get funded, and only half of them actually get discussed in these panels, right? So if a given panel has 75 grants or 70 grants, only 35 of them are actually going to go to the point where they're brought up and discussed. So half of the grants aren't even going to get looked at. So it's competitive, to say the least.
Yeah, and if you think about it, you have each reviewer has 5 to 10 grants to read, and when I review grants, it takes me probably like 4 hours, right, to read a grant. So by the time you're at your 5th grant reviewing, you're tired. And to Paul's point, you want to make it as easy as possible for them to digest the material. It has to be laid out in a way that doesn't require any extra energy on their part.
Yes, indeed. Good point. And I hope that will get reiterated several times down as we go along here. Just a quick review on and again, it's safe in this crowd to be NIH focused, because most of you are going to be, if you are submitting grants, going to be to the NIH. But conceptually, all of this stuff applies to any grant application. It's really just the details that are different. But an NIH grant is typically composed of these 4 sections: a specific aims page, which is a separate 1-page summary. It doesn't count towards your page limit. And that's what we're going to be talking mostly about now. It has a significance section, which is really just a concise description of why your research is important, and it has to be directed to the relationship between your project and any effect on human health that it might have. Why should this be funded by the National Institutes of Health as opposed to the National Science Foundation? That's one way to think about it. Used to be called the significant background and significance section. Obviously, you have to have some background in here, but they took that word out so that people would stop writing these massive review articles in front of their grants. Really, you just want to keep a really focused, what's relevant to your project. There's an innovation section, which is very short. It's really just a place for you to call out truly innovative aspects of your proposal, or how you're totally sort of revolutionizing the field you're in. And then finally, there's the approach, and this is the meat of the grant. This is where you're going to have a detailed experimental plan, and each one of these aims that you're going to propose, really can be broken down into providing a short sentence on context, some preliminary data, a hypothesis, and then what experiments are you going to do to test those hypotheses. All right, so as you already know, we've been talking about focusing on the specific aims page. And you might ask, why are we focusing on the specific aims page? And it's simply, if you think about what it is, it has to accomplish a lot, right? It's a 1-page summary of the entire project. And I hate to say it, but there's certainly evidence that there are reviewers who don't necessarily read the entire grant in detail. And if they do read something in detail, it's going to be the specific aims page. So you really want to win over certainly your primary reviewer just with this 1 page. So if we go back to thinking about what you have to accomplish here, well, there's a lot of overlap between what you need to accomplish for a specific aims page and what you need to accomplish for the whole grant, of course, but a little bit of a twist. So obviously you need to provide evidence that you're an expert. And again, all of this has to happen on this 1 page. You need to have a clearly stated significant problem with testable hypotheses. a series of creative experiments that expertly test the hypotheses, enough information to make a preliminary determination about score, right? So you really want to prepare the mind of the reviewer to evaluate your grant according to the specific games page. And ideally, you want to provide evidence that the rest of the grant is going to be really easy to read and, more importantly, interesting. And the way I like to think about this is you want the reviewer to not stop and actually just to continue reading the grant. I know I don't know if Janet does this, but I typically will read the bio sketch first, then I read the specific games page, and then I typically move on. And just this is like during the survey phase of the several phases of grant review. What you want is your reviewer to be so excited about this project that they just keep reading, right? And they want to read the whole thing. So let's talk about how or what it means to have a good one-page summary. Well, I would argue that simply means you want to have a clear, compelling story. And I emphasize the story part of this, right? Because everybody understands and likes stories. And if you can convey that kind of excitement and actually include the elements of some classical creative writing aspects, not that you want to, get creative with the writing, but create some tension in your story, things tend to be a lot more interesting to read. So to be clear, I think that simply means you want to have a simple flowing narrative, right? Keep it simple. To be compelling, obviously you need to have amazing ideas and preferably amazing preliminary data. And to do a story, really, again, this goes back to the point where if the reviewer is reading the specific games page and they think of it like they're reading a story, they'll want to continue on to the next chapter. So more specifically, how do you write clearly? You write short, active, logically placed sentences. Seems obvious, but it's not. The compelling part doesn't change, same thing. And to do a story, one of the ways to help you do this, this is where the hard work comes in, but one of the ways to do it is to really, and we'll talk about this later, what I mean by topic sentences, but you want to use topic sentences to help you create a paragraph structure that's clear and fiercely maintain the flow of logic, right? So and basically it means don't bounce around. And if you think about it from the reviewer standpoint, paragraph structure is really important. First of all, it provides some sort of visual presentation that you've spent the time thinking about how you're laying out your project. If you just have a whole page that's one big blob of text, it's really hard to sit down and get excited about that, even no matter what the text is, right? So it's really about, at least in terms of infrastructure, it's really about paragraphs. All right, so yes, and the writing is key. All right, so now we're going to start talking about some of this stuff that I think could be considered theory, and I want you to visualize a funnel when you're writing every paragraph. And again, this what we're talking about mainly with regard to the specific games are the first two paragraphs that introduce your entire project. It's the first thing the reviewer is going to read, and it needs to be crystal clear. And it needs to be crystal clear to all of these reviewer types, right? And therein lies the challenge. So if you think about a funnel, the funnel means you're going from a broad context all the way down to the very narrow testable hypothesis. And this sort of method that I'm suggesting to you actually uses two different funnels. But let's just take a look at what the first funnel looks like with regard to the first paragraph. Again, this is the very first thing that is going to orient your reviewer. In the broad context, you can simply ask the question, all right, what is known, right? Just enough background to set the stage. Then you narrow the context, and these could actually be a single sentence, and it's kind of a fun challenge to try and do that. And just sit down and answer these questions with a single sentence. And then you probably have to use two per thing, but it's again, if you force yourself to be concise from the get-go, I think you'll actually be better off in the long run. So to narrow the context, you could, for example, say, all right, how has my work contributed to this background, this key background that's related to this project? And then you want to pivot to the problem, right? You're going to say, well, we know this from what I did and what the literature says, but we don't know this, right? What is the problem? And then you can lay out an overarching hypothesis, right? What is the overall goal of this topic that you're talking about? And again, the details are pretty light in this section. And I would say that we spend most of our time when we have sort of group sessions and this kind of thing, parsing out what goes in what paragraph, because you really want to keep this, if you think about it, you want to keep this paragraph, mainly your target would be this tertiary reviewer that needs to understand this field, but doesn't really necessarily need to understand the nitty-gritty, or at least won't understand it, and you don't want to confuse them from the get-go, right? So that's one way to think about it. So the second paragraph is exactly the same structure, but simply brings in another level of detail. So now your broad context is really going to be, okay, what is the precise state of the art relevant to this project? And then your narrowing context would actually be an opportunity for you to talk about preliminary data that's going to be featured in this grant. And then you pivot from your preliminary data. Well, we just found this, but it leads to this massive set of questions that we want to address. It's a possibility I'm going to have a sneezing fit. I just want to warn you.
Okay. I will just say something about then maybe while you're sneezing. Whenever you say that you don't sneeze.
I know it's working so well.
And it's very dissatisfying not to be able to sneeze. In the previous slide, when for the go back for a sec. The narrow context, you may not have your body. It may not be your body of work. So don't you don't be upset if you don't have anything to share. Save what you've done for the second paragraph. I think the key prior findings can either be from your PI's lab or, as Paul said, the field.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I should probably edit this for students. And it's also actually theoretically possible to submit grants without preliminary data, although it's never recommended, even when the NIH says you don't have to. But it as Janet said, it doesn't necessarily for students have to be your work, right? It could be something the lab is just whatever's leading you to ask the questions you're actually asking. That's the thing you want to focus on, right? Whether it's from the literature or your own work is less relevant. Okay. I don't remember if I got through all this, but
you're at the hypothesis.
Data, so we pivoted to the problem. So you're going to have a specific statement of your scientific premise, and then move directly into a testable hypothesis. Now, this is actually pretty tricky because each of your aims is also going to have a hypothesis, right? So you may not be able to do this, and it depends on the nature of the project, but ideally, you will be able to come up with a pretty specific hypothesis that leads to the aims, right? To leads to the even more specific hypotheses that will be in the aims themselves. And this is not stuff you're just going to be able to sit down and crank out at once, right? This is why I emphasize the work part. And it's actually really helpful to get feedback on this, which is kind of the foundation of this program, is to have a group setting and getting feedback from your peers and a mentor as you work through this stuff. And I obviously I totally buy into this idea, because if you spend the time to do this for the specific aims page, writing the rest of the grant becomes much easier. And I can attest to that, right? I took me a while to actually commit to doing that, because to be honest, usually when I sit down and write a grant, I start writing the aims first, and then you end up changing everything. And so one time a few years ago, I sat down and said, okay, I'm gonna practice what I preach. I spent a couple of weeks on the specific aims page, and when you have the aims, you really rigorously need to go through them with people who know what the hell you're talking about, and make sure that the experiments make sense. Again, focus on the science first and get all this stuff nailed down, and then you have a much easier time of writing the details in the grant. You're not meant to read this, which is probably good because you probably can't, but this is really just a recommended structure. This shows the 2-paragraph structure followed by the aims. You can see that it's roughly half and half. I typically use bullet points for the aims because as a reviewer, that's what I like to see. And as a writer, that's how I like to convey clarity. I'd say that less than half of the grants that I read use this format. And I think it's because people think it wastes space. I violently disagree with that. If you feel like you need to cram so much into the specific aims page, then you need to just start over and think about how you can convey it clearly. Just imagine as a reviewer how much easier it is to pull out important points in something as detailed as a specific experiment that you want to do. I find it much easier to be in. I don't know, Janet, why don't you proffer your opinion on this while I stop ranting?
I hid my video instead of unmuting. I totally agree. And, I actually think it's easier to read stuff when there's white space. Besides the fact that there's bullets, it's like less exhausting to read something when there's white space and things pop out more. So the only difference for you guys would be that you probably would only have 2 aims. So you can maybe each of those ABC sub sentences could be 2 sentences. If you wanted to fill the page, you could go one level deeper into like how you are going to identify and characterize the RNA binding proteins, blah, blah, blah,
Yeah.
Just a suggestion.
And actually that's a great suggestion. And what we ended up doing in a few group sessions was adding we expect, after you'd have your bullet points, have a sentence that says we expect to blah, 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 so that your reviewer's naturally going through that process, right? You want to keep in mind this process of having 1 sentence background, preliminary data, what's the hypothesis, how are you testing the hypothesis, and then you can wrap up with we expect to get this result, so that there's no question in the mind of the reviewer what you are thinking.
I had a question on that.
Yeah.
So if you have a figure or an illustration, so what would you compromise on? Either the first 2 paragraphs or the specific aims, and just letting go of the bullet points and trying to save space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have a strong opinion on this, and I'll try and justify it. I think that it's incredibly rare when it's justified to put a figure in the specific aims page. If you think about, and you just explained why, right? You actually do have a small amount of space. And then you want to ask, okay, what do you want to accomplish with a figure in the specific aims page that you couldn't do much better in the rest of the grant, right? The challenge is that to get a figure that's good and actually contains all the information that it needs to have in order to be understandable, it takes up too much space on this particular page. And that kind of goes.
Just to clarify, we're talking about like a model. Is that what you're talking about, Regina, when you say figure?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's, I was just going to say, that's the only time I've seen the good use of a figure in a specific aims page is if you have a really, and I mean really complex pathway or something that you need to constantly refer to. It wouldn't hurt to have it there. But again, it's definitely a trade-off, as you said, right? That you're gonna potentially reduce the clarity of your writing by taking up space with the figure, and sometimes that works. But I have to say, I don't know, Janet can also give her sort of experience. In the past 7 years I've been reviewing for the NIH K99 panel, I can think of maybe one time when I've seen a figure in the specific aims page. It's just typically not done. Mm-hmm. And so I guess there's also a component of the conformity aspect of this, right? It's not something the reviewers expect to see.
But that doesn't mean you can't put it in the body of your grant. And
yeah, and I actually have added a little thing at the end of this emphasizing the value of figures. It's incredibly important to have good figures. Emphasis on good also, because it's actually pretty bad to have a bad figure in there. I get irate if there's a figure that either isn't explained, like there's all this data on a figure, but they don't explain what it is, and there's extraneous stuff, and that's worse than not having a figure, in my opinion. But
Hadi is asking, and maybe Hadi, you can expound upon this. Do we have to worry about return on investment in grant writing? And are you talking about like actual financial return on investment, or sort of more conceptual return on investment? Like the NIH is giving you $1 million and they're worried about if they're going to get $1 million worth of results from you. Is that what you're talking about, Hadi?
Yeah, because I can only imagine how complex it is. Like, so for example, if you're writing an NIH grant on like selenium versus, I don't know, titanium, for example, how did you pick which one is better, right?
Yeah, that's a really complicated question. I think the short answer is that the NIH underfunds the research to the point where it's not even relevant to have a conversation about ROI, because it's not possible, right? You have to scrape together every single resource, and typically you're proposing stuff that you're never going to get done because they're going to cut your budget, and so I guess I'm inefficiently saying that I don't think that that's really a consideration for a basic science grant. If you were writing a what are those things, STTR, one of those business development grants, it would be a totally different thing. But when you're getting started in your career, the key thing is to focus on the quality of the science, right? Is there justification for the project you're proposing, and is the outcome likely to lead to a significant result in the context of human health, broadly speaking, right? Very broadly speaking, depending on the institute. I think that's the way to think about it, right? Not in terms of dollars or anything like that, but in terms of the quality of the outcome that you're likely to get based on what you're proposing. And since you brought it up, it's important to keep in mind who you're writing the grant to. Even in the context of NIH, there are different institutes at the NIH. So the institute I submit to is NIGMS, General Medical Sciences, right? So there's pretty much anything goes. And although that's where they expect to see really basic science stuff, which if you've read any of what's in front of you, you would know is what we're talking about, as opposed to where Janet submits, which I don't even know what it is, NDA?
NINDS.
NDS. So the mission of that institute affects how you're going to try and sell your grant. And that's essentially what we're talking about, right? So you do want to keep those things in mind, but not to the point where you're concerned that the amount of money they're giving you is actually is going to result in a certain quantifiable product.
There's another question. What are the differences in writing a grant for a clinical study with PK data versus a basic science grant?
Actually, not that much, right? So in terms of the writing, exactly the same principles apply no matter what you're writing about. And as you'll see when we get through this, that fundamentally what we're talking about is how to write clear sentences. It's nothing more than that. When you're getting to the level of talking about clinical versus basic science, again, it goes back to who your target audience is, right? And there are certainly aspects you have to think about in clinical studies that you don't have to think about for basic science. I would say mainly your statistical power, making sure you have, represent the IRB and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's all about clearly presenting the rationale and the value of the results that you're going to get.
There's another question about if you can explain NIH versus NSF grants.
Not sure we can do that in the context of this this setting, but I'm happy to take a short stab at it. And really, NIH is the institute under the federal government that is designated to support research into human health. So again, it's very broadly speaking, and obviously basic science applies. And I think maybe the most of the NIH consists of institutes that are pretty related to specific diseases or health systems or that kind of thing. But the NIGMS that I just mentioned is kind of you can think of as the transition, right? This very basic science is allowed there, but typically it's going to be stuff like this, which is in front of you, which is about trace elements. It's something still related to human health, even though it's foundational. NSF funds things that have nothing to do with human health, right? Marine biology, agriculture, and there's overlap. There's definitely overlap, but you can think of really foundational stuff being funded by the NSF as opposed to the slightly more restrictive nature of NIH funding.
Right. Well, just to clarify, I mean, a biologist can apply to NSF, but NSF wants to know that you're discovering the mechanism by which RNA gets translated. They don't want you to tell them that you're examining the cause of autism and how RNA translation is involved in onset of autism. So, I think what I used to say, like NSF will become something that goes into a textbook. Like, you're furthering the knowledge of the sciences, and NIH is more translational. They want to hear about the disease. That may be general, but that's the way I think about it.
Yep, that works.
I see Hadim has another question, but I think we should move on. Hadi, sorry, and we'll probably get there.
Yeah, let's get through this rest of the stuff, and then we can pick up the conversation. I have a separate slide here on the first sentence, just because it's actually, I think it's a lot of fun. And when we do this as kind of a workshop in person, I like to have everybody sit down and write their first sentence and sort of discuss it. And so you can do that. I'm happy to give you feedback. There's basically three types of first sentences, and I kind of put three examples here. And it's a balance between achieving enough specificity to keep your expert reviewer interested, but not so general that it seems stupid, right? So the second sentence here is the one that I think reaches that balance. But let's just go through these. Sentence number one: LVAD implantation significantly improves inpatient rehabilitation when compared to the same procedure performed in an outpatient setting. That would make total sense to somebody who, first of all, knows what LVAD is, and second of all, is in the field, right? So a little bit too specific to be a good first sentence for your specific aims page. We'll skip to the third one. Patient outcomes are affected by the length of hospital stay. Well, no kidding, right? So if you find yourself saying, no kidding, everybody knows this, then it's probably too general. And the second sentence is where there's an attempt at least to have some balance. End-stage heart failure is often treated with the left ventricular assist device. Now we know what LVAD is, but the success of this treatment depends on the length of postoperative care. So the fact that this is a slightly longer sentence is okay, because it needs to convey both that you're talking about end-stage heart failure, but also really this is focusing on hospital length of stay, right? And so anytime that you can add a little bit of specificity to your statements, I think you're going to get a better response from the reviewers. All right, this is not about art. I finally remembered to include a little break here to have this stands for acronym, rant, and tirade. And actually I've kind of distilled this down to a recommendation. When you write your specific aims page, do not use, at least for the first draft, do not use a single acronym. None of it, absolutely none of it, unless DNA or something like that, whatever. But and I think that what you'll find is, first of all, the thing that you were going to abbreviate, you actually don't use as often as you think you were going to. And second of all, it doesn't save that much space. And not using acronyms significantly increases clarity, especially for people of a slightly advanced age. And I like to convey, and Janet can confirm or deny, that nowadays, when I'm reading a specific aims page and I come across an acronym that I don't know, the very next sentence, I will have forgotten what it is. Maybe 2 sentences later, but regardless, I have to stop. I have to go back and see what it was. And disrupting that flow of reading is actually really destructive to this whole concept that you want to have a nice flowing story here. So that's my rant. And I think that most students I've sort of convinced to create a version without acronyms have ended up sticking with it, right, and not including them in the specific games page. And then, if you really feel strongly about it, you can use the acronym in the body of the grant. But again, think about whether it's actually saving you any space and accomplishing what you want to accomplish. All right, so finally, we're getting into these, what are called the 6 principles of clear writing. Okay, so all of this stuff was grant related. Now this is really just about the writing. This first concept is called sequence, old to new. It's really just connecting concepts, right? And you'd be surprised how common it is for people not to do this. So let's go through the example. The less clear example is all analyses will be conducted with survey data derived from interviews. Instrument design was conducted using the minimum item articulation method. By the way, most of the examples are complete fiction, so don't worry about that. The point here is that there's this pause that the reviewer has to undergo when going from derived from interviews, period, instrument design. Like, what the hell is the instrument? What are we talking about, right? And so that's a lack of clarity that needs some sort of transition, right? So the attempt to introduce clarity simply means to connect the two things together. All analyses will be conducted with survey data derived from interviews. The survey instrument design was conducted using the minimum item articulation method. So now we know, without having to pause or think about it, that this instrument design is directly related to the survey construction. Number 2, sequence light to heavy. This is really just about getting to the point quickly and putting the point at the beginning of your sentence, right? So don't front load your sentence with a lot of extra stuff and then get to the point. So the example is mild to moderate upper limb impairment and loss of facial motor control are outcomes often experienced by patients who suffer from ischemia caused by stroke. I can't see that. And these symptoms are tightly correlated with specific brain imaging analyses. So by the time you get through the sentence, you're like, what in the hell is this about? And so you want to think about, what do I really want this sentence to be about? And you move that to the front. So as you can see from the more clear example, we've decided that this project is really about brain imaging, and that's the context for this paragraph. So we bring brain imaging to the front. Brain imaging can be used to quantify the severity of stroke outcomes, such as mild to moderate upper limb impairment and loss of facial motor control. Completely flip the sentence around, but you've emphasized the point that you really want the reviewer to grab hold of first. And it's really just to keep the reviewer from getting distracted from other things. And again, helping that flow. Oops. Transition words. This one's pretty obvious. I'm not even going to read the examples, but basically another way to avoid kind of stilted language and creating lack of clarity by having things not connected is to use transition words. And so in the example, there's a bunch of stilted sentences here, and the author of this, which was not me, added time transition words, right? So you'll see, in recent years, researchers have made, not too long ago. That's one way to link things together and create flow in your writing. Echo words. This is actually a really important concept that people that are really into the nitty-gritty of their field often don't even notice. But it's really important not to use different terms to refer to the same thing. And this example, which again is too long to read, but basically it's an example about histology, and the author refers to specimens in 4 different ways, calls them tissues, specimens, samples, sections. And if you're not an expert, you're not going to know that those are all exactly the same thing. So simply by going back and making sure that when you're referring to something, you always call it something, and not to confuse your reviewer. Strong verbs. This is the classic, don't use the passive voice, which I'm sure everybody's heard before. And I generally agree that it's best to use active verbs, as sometimes the passive voice has value. So, it's not a strict rule, but you can see in this example that you can convert something that's somewhat complex and lengthy to a more clear statement. In a study of patients with recent ischemic stroke, previously analyzed patient data was shown to be coincidentally linked to prior exposure to hypoxia. So there's kind of a couple things going on here. First of all, the point of the sentence is at the end. We're using passive voice for the verbs was shown. And we have this word coincidentally, which really isn't adding anything to this, right? So you can convert this to exposure to hypoxia was recently linked to the incidence of ischemic stroke. So you can clearly see, no pun intended, how you can achieve clarity by removing some words and moving things around to make a more active sentence. And finally, avoiding parentheticals. And it's important to understand the difference between a parenthetical and a compound sentence. So a compound sentence is like the example of the first sentence that we had a few slides ago. That was a compound sentence where you essentially have two sentences in one, but you're extending an idea by using a compound. A parenthetical is when you're using the word which, typically. Or in this case, autism, comma, a disease that affects more than 1.5 million children in the US alone, comma, is a complex multidimensional disease that is commonly misdiagnosed. So that's a parenthetical. And then in addition to this parenthetical, we also have a compound sentence. And it has recently been found to be more prevalent in people with mutations with the NDM1 gene. So there's a whole lot of problems with this sentence, but the main issue is that I'm trying to point out here is the use of parentheticals. You really want to evaluate whether or not it's necessary and whether or not it should be a separate sentence that you put somewhere else. And oftentimes it's introducing something that's not relevant, right? So in this case, we just got rid of it, or actually just change that entire parenthetical to a single word. Autism is a prevalent and complex disease that has unknown etiology. And this is also kind of reducing complex language into simple language. Recent evidence suggests that mutations in the NDM1 gene may correlate with autism. So we divided this into two sentences and really focused on the flow, right? Connecting these two things together. So we've gotten rid of the parenthetical. We want to establish that autism is a prevalent disease, but we don't know its molecular basis. And we think that this gene is involved. And by the way, Janet, I think I've used this example before, but the NDM1 gene we all know is fake, right? I didn't actually look it up, but hopefully it's not a real gene.
I had not heard of it, so yes.
Maybe it's the answer, who knows? All right, so this is just one slide, and I'm not going to torture you.
Oh wait, before we move on, can I just say that you know, I think that's the last slide is really important because you don't want to get lost in the sentence. So short sentences, don't make your language flowery and long and elaborate. Make your sentences short and sweet and to the point. So, yeah.
Thank you for reiterating that. And this reminds me to say the thing that I usually, you know, everything you learned in creative writing in college, you should just throw out the window, right? This is not about creative writing in any way, shape, or form. This is about clear communication, and they're fundamentally different. And you'll occasionally read maybe a review article that somebody reverts to their sort of, my advisor used to use a particular author, like Hawthornian sort of version of a review article. It's torture, right? Nobody wants to read that. You want the facts, science. So there's a whole field of science communication, and I know Janet knows a lot more than I do about that. And I think that's also an interesting topic to discuss, and really a version of this conversation sort of in the context of paper writing, I think would be pretty valuable, because when you're writing up actual data, it's fundamentally different, right? Grants are a lot easier in that respect because you're not constrained by data. But when you're writing up actual results, there's a whole sort of another set of techniques I think that are useful to think about. Not that I'm volunteering to do a session on that, Janet, but I think maybe somebody should. All right, paragraph structure. Again, this is something that sounds trivial, and I like to emphasize it a lot because it changed the way that I write. When you really sit down and think about forcing yourself to use topic sentences, right? And what that means is you write out what the entire paragraph is going to be about in one sentence, and you don't stray from that, right? So that's actually what the paragraph is about. You don't add any extra stuff in there, and you actually include at the end of this a transition sentence, right? A transition to what's going to be the next topic sentence. And if you really take the time to do this, there will be kind of a hint of what the next topic sentence is going to be in the last sentence of your previous paragraph. And that's the ultimate way to have flow, right? So that there's no reason to hesitate. except to kind of catch your breath, have a little bit of white space, and you know, enjoy the story. All right. Now, in terms of format, I just add a little bit more detail about the sections. So the significant sections, typically 1 to 2 pages at the most. Innovation, half a page or sometimes even less. And you know, I like to convey that I've never seen a grant, actually nobody comments on the innovation, right? It's a section that the NIH put in there because typical kind of administrators sit around a table and think about what would be a good thing to have in a grant. Oh, we should talk about innovation, but it's actually a really hard thing to nail down as a writer and as a reviewer. So it doesn't have a huge impact in my experience. And then the approach, of course, is you know, for your what are they called, training grants that you would be applying for. There's typically 6-page grants, and that's again separate from the 1-page summary. So you basically have 4 to 5 pages just to write the approach section. Oh, and I will again reemphasize that I like to break up my approach section. For each aim, you're going to have the essential background sentence, some preliminary data, a hypothesis, and then you lay out your plan. And then each aim, or even the sub-aims, needs to have an expected results section and potential pitfalls. The latter being essential, right? It's you know, reviewing grants is all about finding those mistakes that you can call attention to, because oftentimes the reviewer has a pile of grants that are superficially indistinguishable. They're all very good, typically, right? They're you know, it's not normal that you get a really bad grant. So somehow you have to distinguish them. Well, leaving out something like a potential pitfall section is an easy way for a reviewer to say, hey, this person isn't thinking about what problems might arise and how they're going to fix those problems. So I'm going to ding them.
Right. And I think that last thing you said about how you're going to fix them, alternative approaches, is really important in that section too. So not just like, you know, what could go wrong, but how would you manage that?
Yeah, that I was trying to keep that on one line, and it definitely needs to have. I need to write this. Every year I'm like, oh, I haven't changed this yet. I need to change this.
Okay, so there's a question. How do you think of potential pitfalls and how to troubleshoot regarding your proposal?
That's a great question, because, and again, it's a little bit outside the scope of this conversation, but a potential pitfall needs to be a real pitfall, right? It can't be some trivial thing like, oh, we might not be able to clone this gene or something. It needs to be something that, if you sit back and think about, okay, what's the weak point in this method that I just laid out? And if that weak point, turns out to actually be a roadblock, what workaround can I come up with to arrive at the same conclusion, or at least attempts to arrive at the same conclusion using a different methodology, and that kind of thing. So it's really important not to have trivial pitfalls, and really think about what is the weakness in because every aim has a weakness, right? And do
you want to give an example? I think that might be helpful.
I knew you were going to say that.
Well, okay, let's say like, I'm going to do single cell RT-PCR, or, to do something. And well, we might not be representative of, I don't know, all the cell. Do you want to focus on technical pitfalls or conceptual pitfalls?
So I think that it's dangerous to focus on technical pitfalls, because, then you're calling into question the methodology that you've chosen, right? So I guess the pitfall is that using single cell sequencing may not be the correct approach to get the answer that you wanted, right? So the genes that you're looking at may not be, maybe there's not transcriptional regulation or something, and so you wouldn't see that in that particular method. Maybe that's a good example, right? So if you're looking at gene regulation and you're proposing all this genomic analysis, and you've skipped over the fact that there might not be regulation at the RNA level, that's something that you could put in as a pitfall.
Right.
It should be obvious to you, right? You should be really worried about the pitfall, right? You're right up all this stuff. You're so deep into what this experiment is, and you're like, oh man, what if this doesn't work, or what if this doesn't give me the result that I expect? That's kind of why it's lumped together with the expected results section, because it's kind of like, well, we expect to get this result, but if we don't, and this is why we might not, this is what we're going to do.
Right. And I don't know, do you have aim dependence? Do you have a slide on aim dependencies, or should we talk
I don't
about
have a whole
that?
slide on it, but I have it is a bullet point, I
Okay.
think, on the
I'll
next
keep mine.
slide.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is just kind of, Janet alluded to one of the things on this, and it's kind of a mishmash of other things to think about. The first one is actually really, really, really important. And that before you spend a lot of time writing up a specific project, you can practice writing on anything. And you know, I've certainly worked with people who don't have, I'm working with a physician right now who doesn't actually have a grant to write. So, you know, you got to take some time to think about the project, but all of you are going to be actually have projects that you will have made some progress on before you're writing your proposal, if for those of you who are first or second years. So you want to sit down, outline your aims or your project goals, sit down with your lab, whoever you can get to listen to you, and actually make sure that you have all that stuff nailed down before you start writing. In terms of grant writing for specific mechanisms, it's really, really important to actually read the request for proposals, which has multiple names: funding opportunity announcement, program announcements, call for proposals, whatever. The NIH and NSF in particular like to sneak stuff into those. They're essentially instructions. But they're not easy instructions. It's not like they have 1, 2, do this, this, and this. No, you have to read the whole thing, and really, it's almost a interpretation art. So you do have to read them carefully, and they love to change things, right? So if you applied for one thing one year and you're going to apply for the same thing the next year, you can't get away with just doing the same way. They will have changed something. Avoid dependence. This is what Janet was about to talk about, right? So in general, you don't want your aims to be dependent on each other, right? You don't want to propose to do a bunch of experiments, for example, data collection in a certain system in aim 1, and then use all of that data in aim 2. And if you're unable to collect that data for whatever reason, aim 2 is completely meaningless, right? So they certainly can be connected to each other and answering the similar questions, but you want to have approaches that are not dependent on each other. I like this to rant a little bit about finding joy in this process, which sounds crazy, but I think it's something that you want to continually ask yourself whether you do enjoy it, because this is the time in your career to kind of sort this out. If you find this to be completely torturous and don't actually enjoy the process of sitting down and getting ideas down on paper, you don't have to actually, get thrilled about it. And trust me, I think everybody is, approaches grant writing with a heavy dose of skepticism and fear. Maybe those aren't the right words, but there's certainly not true joy in the process of sitting down to write a grant. But at the end of the day, you have to enjoy it or you're not going to be successful at it. You also have to come up with great, I have to say, I complain a lot about writing grants, but if I'm honest, the best ideas I've come up with were in the process of writing a grant, right? Because you're forced to actually communicate, even if it's just communicating to yourself. That process is really important in the development of ideas, I find. So take that for what it's worth. Use figures liberally. There's a kind of a rule of thumb to try and get a figure on every page. I don't know if you need to, that might be excessive, but the key point, there's 2 key points. One that I don't have written down here. One is this idea of a model figure is really helpful. And I like to put model figures on the first page of the significance section. And the point is to have a point of reference for your reviewer, right? So every project is going to have a level of complexity that would make it useful for the reviewer to have some diagram to refer, for lack of a better term, to refer back to during the process of figuring all this stuff out. So I highly recommend that. Otherwise, I'll just reiterate that if you're going to use a figure, do it right. It needs to have a figure legend. It needs to not have stuff that you're not going to talk about in there. It needs to be readable, right? So all the little text around the figure needs to actually be legible. So don't make it so small that you can't read it. And really, it shouldn't be that much different than a figure that you put in a paper. Although that's debatable. And finally, this is not relevant really for students, but in grant writing in general, you should think of the people at the funding agency as resources. So the people who actually manage the process of awarding grants are called program officers. These are the people who they have a particular portfolio of grants that they maintain. And so that they're the ones who are thinking about the projects. And if you want to just sort of get a feel for whether your grant is appropriate for funding in their portfolio, they're happy to take a look generally. More so at the NIH than the NSF, I found, but it never hurts to ask, right? So, and then you're getting feedback from somebody who can actually, give you a very clear answer as to whether or not your project is relevant for their portfolio. More often than not, they're going to say, well, maybe, but sometimes they'll say, no, you really should be thinking about this particular agency. And again, it's hard to convey this without going into the details of how NIH works, but the bottom line is to seek out resources at the funding agency.
Yeah. One other thing I was going to say, a couple of things. First of all, NSF does require, I think, a letter of intent. So in terms of timing, you want to start this early. Look, as he said, at all the RFA and the time deadlines. And also, so those of you, somebody recently told me they didn't realize they were applying for a pre-doctoral fellowship and they didn't realize that our Rutgers grants office needs your grant 5 days before the deadline. So almost the very first thing you need to do is talk to the person who's going to be submitting your grant from the business office or the grants office of your PI's department and get the deadlines that they need things by. They need a budget very early on. They can't start putting it in RAPS, which is the system that we use to submit grants at Rutgers, without having a budget. And then they need a placeholder for many of the other sections. So you can send them a version of your grant, but keep editing it up until 5 days before. Paul, are those the right timelines? Something like that.
5 days, yeah, 5 days for all of the budget and the supplementary stuff, and
Right.
and then 2 days. You have 2 full days ahead of this deadline. You have to have your final draft in.
Right. And the other thing is that people don't realize about fellowships is you need letters of recommendation. And I've gotten last minute requests for those. So make sure that you identify who's going to write you letters of recommendation. It's quite a few, I think, that you need. And your sponsor, who is your PI, also needs to write a letter. And there's all these other sections that you need that I have templates for. So there's something called institutional environment, and you should ask me for a template and I'll modify it for you. You need the sections on responsible conduct of research, on career development opportunities. There's a whole component of like your education and your training. It's not just the science, actually. And for pre-doctoral fellowships, actually, those aspects are very important because they want to make sure that you are getting the full educational components, not just the hands-on experimental part.
Yeah.
Janet,
this kind of makes me think that maybe in the future we should have a separate session on nuts and bolts kind of stuff.
Right. Well, I do talk about some of this in the fall workshop that we do. I just didn't want to let this go with, in case people weren't at the fall workshop.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and working with Grad Fund at Rutgers is really helpful because you get eyes on your proposal that are people outside of your field a little, so they read it from a language perspective, from a clarity perspective. So really, I do encourage everybody to work with Grad Fund and get an advisor there to go over it. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the concept of grantsmanship, which is you're selling your idea, right, to the NIH or to whatever funding agency it is. And ideally you do carry out the experiments as you propose. But it's okay if once you get funded, things change and you end up having to rejigger your aims or change things on the fly. So don't freak out later on if that happens. But what you want to do is tell a story in your grant.
I'm glad you said that, because I was just going to say that another word for grantsmanship can be the story, right? And if you focus on telling a clear story, grantsmanship will come naturally, right? And I think that's a relatable way to think about, what grantsmanship means, because it means different things to different people, but everybody understands the story.
Right. And Mohit asks, can PhD students apply to Grad Fund or the PI? Grad Fund is specifically for PhD students. So what you do, go to their website. They have a great resource in terms of identifying grants that you may be eligible for. I know international students are always curious to find out what they may be able to apply for. So you can use their search feature and your discipline and et cetera, and find a list of grants, make an appointment with them, and you as a grad student will work with them.
So I just wanted to quickly tell you what these links are. If it's not clear, obviously you can find out if you go through them, but there are sample grants from NIDDK, and I think it's actually valuable to look at them just in terms of formatting, and you don't want to get hung up in the details because they're all quite different, but it's one way to just sort of get a bird's eye view of what a grant looks like. The NIH has put together mock peer reviews so that you can see exactly what happens during a peer review session. It's kind of interesting. To access information about the kind of stuff we were talking about with regard to local deadlines, Rutgers has something they call the research portal that has a bunch of resources for grant submission, including links to grant writing resources. NIH has their own thing on grant writing tips, budget development tips, list of grant types. People often ask, like, what do I do? There's actually, I think, hopefully there's a grant type wizard that the NIH has, so that, obviously as students, you're fairly limited to a certain subset of predoctoral grants, but as you move forward, it gets kind of complex. There's information about who's on what study section at NIH, and again, that's not necessarily within the scope here. Finally, maybe I should put this first. The last one is actually important because it's a kind of a series of videos. This Northwestern Climb program is actually the foundation for all the stuff that I just told you. The communications expert that I mentioned at the beginning, created videos around these. There were only 5 principles that he talked about. So if you want a refresher, go back to that website, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff there too.
Right.
Finally, I wanted to talk about this class. I don't know if that's
Yeah. Go ahead. I have a couple of things I will add after.
I know we're actually coming up on 90 minutes here, but so I do offer it's just a 1-credit class, although I could be convinced to change that if I told Janet and I discussed sort of getting a bigger handle on the grant writing offerings for graduate students in general. But right now, the course is 1 credit, and it consists of kind of 3 phases. Although the phases are not equally lengthed, equal time. Basically, we sit down and create an outline of your experimental plan and make sure everybody kind of understands what is going on, so that the reading is a little bit easier. Then you actually generate an essay, a specific aims page. You're getting feedback from the mentors. We record from the mentor and your peers. We record the sessions because oftentimes people are able to verbalize what they can't write, and so that helps. And then finally, you'll actually draft a name. One of the, there's really not time to in a 1 credit course to do the whole grant, but we review the actual aim that you've drafted, and also, if there's time, draft the significant section using topic sentences and that kind of thing. So basically, it's a reiteration of what we just talked about in the context of your own project. And the important part is that you're getting feedback from both your peers and the mentor. We have had 2 sections of this class in the past, so I run one and Susie Chen runs the other. I'm not sure if she's going to be able to do that moving forward, but as I said, we're going to evaluate what offerings are actually out there and think about it.
So there's a question, what's the course number and what department is it under?
It's MMG. It's in the MMG program, 681. I think the course number is 601.
Yeah. So on this, I just put a link in the chat, which takes you to the website where we list resources. So I also have sample successful grants from New Jersey Commission, NIH, NSF, American Heart. So the grad fund is not allowed to supply those, but if you are writing a grant and want to see one that has gotten funded to use as a template, write to me and I will send those to you. And then also there's the link to grad fund on that page. And what was the other thing? There were questions. Oh yeah, rigor and reproducibility is another major thing that grants are looking for, the reviewers are looking for, which is, have you done a thorough power analysis to determine what your sample size should be? They want to know that you are as statistically rigorous as you can be, and that you've thought about all of the issues related to previous research that may be questionable, et cetera. So rigor and reproducibility. This session is recorded. I will make it available to everybody who attended, as well as the slides that Dr. Copeland will send me. And there's a question about translating a well-scored fellowship application to a dissertation proposal. Absolutely, that's a no-brainer. You just print it or make it a PDF and it's pretty much good to go. The other,
that's an important point. I think that my class is actually designed to be preparation for writing your, not your dissertation, but your proposal. Well, that's what that is, dissertation proposal. For your second qualifying exam, going to your committee with what looks like an NIH grant is a really good way to win favor with your committee. So yeah. The format is the same.
And I would say the other way around is more common, which is that you do your thesis proposal and then submit it as an F31. So if you already have a well-scored F31, that's great. The class is offered every spring, as is this workshop. Is rank writing is totally different from fellowship in terms of format? No, a grant and the fellowship are similar. The fellowship will have additional aspects, like I mentioned, that you'll have to get the letters of recommendation and a training plan, et cetera. But on the flip side, a grant that your PI submits, no, I think the fellowship has more components than the grant does. The other thing, there are topics that you may not realize you need, like resources that are available, equipment, things like that. Your PI should be able to provide those for you because they've submitted grants with those sections.
I just want to reiterate, Janet's already mentioned this a couple times, but these other sections, like your training plan, it's not just fluff. These are really important aspects. As I told you, I review for the K99s, and those have very detailed training plans. And I've heard more than once that, oh, this is great science, blah, 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 but the training plan was garbage. So they got a really lousy score. So you can be a brilliant scientist and write a fantastic grant and blow the whole thing because you didn't pay attention to the training plan. So
Right.
make sure you save time for that. Don't put it off to the end. I guess that's the bottom line.
Exactly. And then just going back to Hadi's question, what criteria do basic science grantors use to determine that grant A is preferable to grant B?
That's not really possible to answer. This is where the individuality of study sections comes into play, right? So you'll have, and I'm sure Janet and I have both experienced submitting grants that get reviewed in, reasonably well the first time around. You resubmit the grant and it gets triaged and doesn't even get looked at, or the other way around, right? So there's a lot of personal preference. I had a grant come back that was scored really well by 2 reviewers, and the 3rd reviewer gave it 9s, which is like the lowest possible score. And I went back to the program officer and said, this is kind of, I've never seen this before, this kind of discrepancy. He's like, well, that's difference of scientific opinion. What, that's kind of the answer. So it's important to keep in mind that you're typically grants that are totally different are not being reviewed at the same time, right? So traumatic brain injury grants are not being reviewed by the same people in the same section as grants on selenium, right? So unless they're related. So there's certainly some cohesion in terms of the topics.
Mm-hmm.
I hope that helps.
Other questions? Feel free to unmute or type in the chat. But yeah, the specific aims are the meat of your grant, and then there are many other aspects that you cannot ignore. So make sure you read through the RFA carefully and look at examples. And don't be discouraged if you don't get it. It's a challenging environment right now. So somebody wants to know about the working groups that Dr. Alex Sunis runs.
That's really just limited to postdocs and faculty right now. It's essentially the same thing as my class. Somebody asked about a book. The book that I honestly, I hate grant writing books because it's just, I have a trouble with I guess attention deficit disorder, but I think that one of the links in the slides was to a book that the NIH put out about grant writing. You can find hundreds of them. I would personally, I would go back if you want to like really focus on the writing, use that CLIMB website at Northwestern as a resource.
There's also a class that is in the psychology department that works on F31 applications. So I'll paste in the chat. This is Dr. Copeland's class. And this one is the sort of more neuroscience-y class. I thought Dr. Alex Sunis's workshop was for grad students as well. I thought she runs it in the fall.
She has a class. I think it's a class.
No, I think it's just like a working group in the fall.
Yeah. Okay. She definitely does something for students as part of her training grant. Yeah. That's totally separate than the things she does with Susie.
Right. Yeah. So every fall, look for an email from me in the fall when that working group launches. So if you're in the spring, you can take a class. If it's in the fall, you can be part of the working group. And Paul's open to reading your specific aims at any time. So take him up on that offer.
Yeah, that's kind of fun.
All right.
All right, gang. Good luck. Keep in touch. And hopefully I'll see some of you next spring.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Paul, for the great presentation.
My pleasure. Thanks for putting it together, Janet.
Good night. Good night.
Good night.
Good afternoon. I wish.